Good morning. Today we are going to go through day 2 of sine and cosine graphs. So the title for today's lesson is 8.4 Sine and Cosine Graphs. Okay, first is we're going to work through writing equations giving specific trigonometric features. Okay, the first question says, what is the equation of a sine function that rises 1 unit above the midline at y equals -3 and has a period of pi over 3? So we talked yesterday about the general form being y equals a sine bx, and then we had the midline as plus or minus d. So I'm going to skip over the phase shift part and just put plus d. Okay? So for this particular equation, we know that the midline is -3. So I'm going to replace the d with a -3. I know that it rises 1 unit above the midline, so that means that my amplitude has to be 1. So y equals, I can choose to put a 1 or I can just do sine. Now I have to find what the b value is. We defined that the period of a sine and cosine graph is 2 pi over b. So if the period is pi over 3, I can say 2 pi over b equals pi over 3 because that's what the period equals. And now I'm going to solve for b by solving using cross products. 6 pi equals b pi, so b equals 6. So I'm going to replace b with 6, put my x in there, and then -3. So my equation would be y equals sine parentheses 6x close parentheses -3. Okay. Next says, what is the equation of a cosine function that rises 2 units above the midline at y equals -4 and has a period of pi? So again, it has that same general form cosine functions do. Y equals a cosine b of x and then plus d. For this particular function, key features 2 units above the midline. Remember yesterday we talked about the amplitude being whatever you move from the midline to the maximum and the midline to the minimum. And so if it rises 2 units above the midline, then the amplitude is 2. Y equals 2 cosine. I'm going to leave b empty for a minute. And I know that the midline is at -4, so I'm going to do -4 at the end. I know my period is pi, so period formula is 2 pi over b, and I'm going to set that equal to pi over 1 because my period is pi. I'm going to solve for b, so I'm going to cross multiply. Pi b equals 2 pi, divide by pi, divide by pi, and so b is 2. And so in the equation, I'm going to stick 2 in for b. Final answer is boxed. Okay, next slide. Write a sine function that has an amplitude of 5, a midline of 4, and a period of 3 over 2. Okay, so amplitude we know goes in front. It's a sine function. So I'm going to start y equals 5 sine. Okay, I know my midline is 4, so I'm just going to do plus 4 at the end. Now I need to determine what my period, what my b value is, excuse me, using my period. 2 pi over b equals 3 over 2. Cross multiply to solve for b. 4 pi equals 3b. Divide by 3. So b equals 4 pi over 3. So I'm going to stick that in here, 4 pi over 3x, because you always want your variable in there as well. Okay. Next question, write a cosine function that has a midline of 5, an amplitude of 4, and a period of pi over 3. So I'm going to set it up. Y equals, my amplitude is 4, so I'm going to start with 4 cosine. I'm not going to solve for my b yet, but I know my midline is 5, so I'm going to do plus 5 at the end. Period is pi over 3, so I say 2 pi over b equals pi over 3. Cross multiply, 6 pi equals b pi, divide by pi, so b has to be 6. And so in the function, I'm going to put a 6 here next to x. Amplitude is 4, midline is y equals 5, and our b value or frequency is 6. Okay. Okay. Next, we're going to work through some examples where we're going to use the graph to write the equation. Okay. So we've talked about the fact that sine graphs start at their midline and cosine graphs start at their maximum value. Okay. So looking at this graph, I can identify my midline as being right here, which is the line y equals 0. I can see, I'm going to use pink, that my amplitude from the max to the min is 1. I can also see that it's starting at a -1, which means it had to have gone through an x-axis reflection. So I'm going to start y equals negative, because it starts at -1 instead of +1. So it goes minimum instead of maximum, minimum, midline, maximum, midline, minimum. I can identify that that's one cycle of a cosine graph. Its period is 2 pi because one cycle lasts from 0 to 2 pi, or it has a length of 2 pi. So your period is 2 pi. And so what that means is that your b value is 1 because only one cycle lasts. So I'm just going to do negative cosine of x. Okay. Next example, I am going to take and identify first the midline. And I can see that my midline is here. Again, it's the x-axis at y equals 0. Okay. I can clearly identify that one cycle of the graph, it's a sine function because it starts at the midline, minimum, midline, maximum, back to the midline. Because it goes to its minimum first, this is another example of an x-axis reflection, right? Because instead of going midline to the maximum, it goes midline to the minimum. So it's been reflected over the x-axis. So our equation would be y equals negative sine. There's only one cycle from 0 to 2 pi, only one cyclic pattern. So 1 would be our frequency because the period is 2 pi. Okay, 1x, or just y equals negative sine x. You don't really have to put that 1 there. It's an understood one. Okay, let's keep going. Next example. I can identify first the midline of the function, and the midline of the function is again the x-axis, y equals 0. I can see that the graph reaches above the midline 1 and below the midline 1. So that means that our amplitude is 1. I can find, because it starts at the midline, I can clearly see that there is 1, and then I'll do another, I'll do like orange, 2. So there's 2 cycles in the span of 2 pi. So that means that our frequency has to be 2, okay? So because the frequency is 2, the period then is pi. 1 cycle lasts pi lengths, right? So the period is pi, and we get, if we did 2 pi over 2, right, because our b value is 2, we would reduce to pi as well. So 1 cycle lasts pi units in length. So for our function, we're going to write y equals, our amplitude is 1. We know it's a sine function. Our b value is 2x, and we're going to close it. The midline is 0, so we don't need to add or subtract. Okay, let's do a few more. All right, finally, a different midline here. Okay, so I see that it reaches as high as +2 and as low as -6, right? And I know that my midline has to be the amplitude has to be equidistant from the midline. So my midline for this function is going to be at y equals -2. How do I know that? The amplitude is 4 from here to here and 4 from here to here. So the amplitude is 4 from the midline to the maximum and from the midline to the minimum. Okay? I can tell it's a sine function because if you start here on the midline, go to the maximum, back to the midline, down to the minimum, back to the midline. I see 1 cycle of the graph lasts through 2 pi. So therefore, my frequency has to be 1 because only 1 cycle is within 2 pi. Okay, so my b value is 1. So I'm going to set up the function y equals 4 sine. My b value is 1, so I'm just going to do x. And then I know my midline is -2, so I'm going to go -2. Okay, I think a couple more. Okay, next one. Remember, we have to identify our midline, and our midline is going to be equidistant to the maximum and the minimum, which gives us our amplitude. So our midline here is y equals 1. Interesting, at the bottom, I see that it goes to 4 pi. So that means that the length of 1 cycle, or our period, is 4 pi. Okay? So in 2 pi, there's half of a cycle, right? It only reaches half of its graph when you get to 2 pi. So that means that your your frequency is 1/2, because half of the graph ends at 2 pi. Okay, and in order to get the period, we would do 2 pi over b, and we're saying that our b is 1/2 because our b is our frequency. 2 pi over 1/2 is 4 pi, which gives us our period. Okay, and then the amplitude, the distance from the midline to the maximum or the midline to the minimum, is 1. So our function would be written y equals, we don't need to put the 1. We know it's a sine function because it starts at its midline. Our frequency is 1/2, that's our b value, 1/2 x. And then our midline is at +1 plus 1. Okay. 9, 10. Okay, 3 more. All right. Okay, next function. I see that it reaches as high as +2, excuse me, and as low as -6. So again, I'm going to identify my midline here. Remember, the amplitude has to be equidistant to the maximum and the minimum. I can see that this graph does not start at the midline. So I know this time I'm going to be working with a cosine function. My cosine function is starting at +2 up here, midline, minimum, midline, maximum. Okay, so we've got our midline at y equals -2. We have our amplitude as 4 because from -2 to +2, it's 4. From -2 to -6, it's also 4. Okay. From 0 to pi/2 is one period of the graph, right? One cycle. So our period is pi/2. So in order to find the frequency, which is our b value, we can either calculate how many times pi/2 goes into 2 pi, or we can set up 2 pi over b equals pi/2, like we did yesterday, and calculate for the frequency, which is b. 2 times 2 pi is 4 pi. 4 pi equals b pi. Divide by pi, b equals 4. Okay, so now the setup of our function, y equals, our amplitude is 4. We've established that it's a cosine function. We know our b value is 4, x, and then the midline is at -2, -2. Oops. Okay. Okay, we have 2 more. Okay, next function is first finding the midline. Okay, so we want to find the midline first, which the midline, it has to be equidistant to the maximum and the minimum. So our midline of the graph is at 5 because it's 2 units from the max and 2 units from the min. So our amplitude is 2. Our midline is y equals 5. Okay. So let's see, I am seeing here that it's starting at its midline. And let's go 1, 2, and 3. So our frequency is 3 because there's 3 cycles of the sine function from 0 to 2 pi. There's 3 cyclic patterns, right? 1, I went too high. 1, back to the midline. 2, back to the midline. 3. So there's 3 from 0 to 2 pi, right? So the period would be 2 pi over 3. Just so we have that written out, we know how we found it. Okay, to write our equation, we have everything we need. We know it's a sine function because it starts at its midline. Y equals 2 is the amplitude, sine. Our b value is the frequency, which is 3x, and then plus 5. Okay, we have 1 more to work through, and then we are done for today. Okay, last function. This is a big one. It goes from 0 and 2 pi is at the end of the function here. So the midline is clearly -2. Y equals -2. From the midline up to the max and down to the min, I'm only moving 1, so our amplitude is 1. The frequency, remember, is how many patterns there are of the function in 2 pi. So I'm going to go with pink and watch the pattern. So midline, max, midline, min, midline. That's one pattern. Midline, max, midline, min, midline. That's 2. And I'm only at pi. Max, midline, min, midline. That's 3. And then midline, max, midline, min, midline. That's 4. So the frequency would be 4. And so the period is 2 pi over b. 2 pi over 4 is pi over 2, which means one pattern completes with a length of pi over 2, which you can see here in blue. One pattern has a period of pi over 2. So for our equation, we're going to write y equals, our amplitude is 1, so we don't need to write 1. We know our function is a sine graph, and our b value is 4x, and then minus 2. Okay, that is it for today. I'm going to give you the assignment. The assignment for today is in Delta Math, and it's 8.4 Trig Graphs Day 2. And that is what you are responsible for completing today. Thank you.